Hi, friends at Corban University. My name is Grant Clay, and I am the executive director of a mission organization called Equipping Leaders for Lifetime of Service International, ELS International with the acronym. And what we do is we travel to places, remote places around the world, and reach pastors who do not have access to Bible schools or seminaries and lack formal theological education to equip them in basic biblical interpretation, preaching skills, so they can more effectively teach God's word and strengthen their churches for the mission of God. So I was supposed to speak to you in your chapel service earlier this week. Because of the COVID-19 crisis, that chapel service isn't going on. In fact, nothing is really going on for many people around the world right now. I know you are probably finishing your classes online. Many of you are very disappointed, I'm assuming, with the current situation, struggling, asking why this is happening, and trying to figure out this new normal that we're all walking in. And we're doing the same thing. We're doing the same thing. And as I've been thinking about this, I realized that there is someone in our Bibles who also experienced social distancing, who also experienced a time of isolation in which they were taken away from doing the very thing that they loved to do and felt like God was calling them to do. And that is the Apostle Paul. Did you know that almost half of Paul's 13 letters were written from prison? Almost half of Paul's 13 letters were written from prison. Think about it. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, and 2 Timothy were all written during a time of social isolation in the Apostle Paul's life. Now, I'm sure many of you have read those letters, and if you haven't, I would highly encourage you to do so, because as you do, you'll find that some of Paul's most richest, deepest theology came out of this time that he had in prison. Came out of his time of being isolated socially from his friends and from the ministry that God had called him to do. In fact, some of God's most important work that he did in Paul's life came out of his experience in being socially distant, so to speak. So what I want to do is just share with you some lessons that I believe Paul has to teach us in our time of social isolation from his letter to the church in Philippi, from the book of Philippians. Now, Philippians was written during a time when one of Paul's imprisonments, and he was writing to the church in Philippi, the city where he had started the church. You can read about that in Acts chapter 16. And he is writing in response to them because they're concerned about how he's doing, if he's lonely, if he's discouraged, if he's depressed. And they sent him a gift of some kind sent by one of Paul's co-workers named Epaphroditus. And Paul responds with this letter back to them. And what they find is that Paul is not discouraged. He's not depressed. In fact, he's joyful. The book of Philippians talks about Paul being joyful and rejoicing and with thanksgiving. In fact, the root word for thanksgiving and joy appear in Philippians more than anywhere else in Paul's letters. How is Paul so thankful? How is Paul so joyful in prison, in social isolation, social distancing? How did he thrive in that situation? Well, that's what I want to share with you today. That's what I want to share with you today. There are three key lessons, I believe, that we learn from Paul's life in Philippians. The first one is how Paul prayed. How Paul prayed, and specifically what he prayed for. In Philippians chapter 1, the Philippians would have spiritual fruits to the honor and glory of God in Jesus Christ. That they bear fruit in their relationship with Jesus. Paul wants the Philippians to be fruitful Christians. Then again, later on in chapter 1, in verses 27 and on, Paul encourages and prays that the Philippians would walk in a manner worthy of Jesus. That they would live their lives in a manner worthy of Jesus and glorify Jesus in all that they did. In Philippians chapter 4, Paul encourages the the Philippians and prays for them that they would rejoice always and have no anxiety about anything, but instead take all their prayer requests to God and trust Him with that and receive the peace of Jesus. And receive the peace of Jesus. Paul wanted them to turn their anxiety into prayer. So Paul prays for spiritual fruit. Paul prays that they would walk in a manner worthy of Jesus, and Paul prays that they would not experience fear and anxiety, but rather turn all that anxiety into prayer and instead experience the peace of Jesus. You see a pattern here, don't you? For Paul, it's all about Jesus. Fruit for Jesus, walking in a manner worthy of Jesus, and experiencing more of Jesus' peace in prayer. That's how Paul prayed. The second thing we see from Paul is that he believed in God's providence. God's providence, that is God's control over all of his circumstances. In Philippians chapter 1, Paul says that he believes that God will complete the good work that began in the Philippian church, in their hearts, in their lives, and will complete it at the day of Jesus Christ, at the day of Christ's return. So Paul believes that God is somehow able to complete and finish the good work that he started. Paul believes that God will get them safely and securely to that last day when they stand before Jesus Christ at his return. Paul also mentions in chapter 1, verses 12 through 14, that in his imprisonment, he's found that the gospel has actually advanced, that things haven't slowed down in terms of his mission work, but in fact they're progressing and they're continuing on. Paul says that it's become evident to the whole prison guard, the people that were watching over him, that his imprisonment was for Christ. So the gospel could be proclaimed to these Roman guards, these guards that were in this whole people that were keeping care of him in his jail, that they're becoming Christians. Paul's found that he's got a prison ministry from being on the inside. These men who would never have a chance to hear the gospel in any other way are hearing the gospel because Paul is a prisoner. Paul believed that God put him in prison on purpose in order that he may share Jesus with these guards. Later on in chapter 4, Paul says that he's learned the secret to be content in any and all circumstances. Paul says that he's learned how to abound and how to have little, how to be hungry and how to be full. In all things he's learned the secret. And he says the secret is this, that he can endure all things, go through all things, be strengthened for all things in the strength that Christ supplies. Most translations say it this way, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Paul believed that God had not abandoned him. Paul believes that God is with him, and Paul believes that God will oversee all of his circumstances and supply him through Jesus with all the strength he needs to get through any and every circumstance. That was Paul's understanding of God's care, God's control, and God's providence over all of his circumstances and situations. Well, finally, Paul had a purpose. Paul had a purpose. While he was there in prison in Rome and writing this letter to the Philippians, he shares what he believes that his life purpose is. And he says in chapter 1, verses 19 through 21, he says that in all things, whether life or death, that he wants Christ to be magnified in his body. He says, nothing else matters to me except that Jesus would be exalted in my living or my dying. And he says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Later on in chapter 3, Paul talks about his pedigree as a Pharisee. And he talks about all the righteousness that he felt like he accrued in following the Mosaic law and following and keeping the Torah. But then he said when he became a Christian, he realized that all of it was dung. All of it was meaningless. Instead, Paul's life purpose now is to know Christ and the power of his resurrection, so that somehow he may attain to the resurrection from the dead, receiving a righteousness not from the law, but through Christ. And then Paul says that he puts everything else behind him and he presses on forward to the upward call of the prize waiting for him in Jesus Christ. Paul's purpose was to see Jesus made known and for him to grow in his own faith in Jesus. So again, whether he's praying or whether he's thinking about God's plans for his life or whether he's thinking about his meaning and purpose in life, it all comes back to this one simple thing: knowing Jesus and telling others about Jesus. What I love about Philippians and Paul's testimony there is that he takes all the complexity of life and he reduces it down to just some very, very simple things. Jesus. Knowing him, glorifying him, and helping others to know him. I've got a quote here that I want to read to you that's become a life quote for me by a famous New Testament scholar. And when he wrote a commentary on Philippians, he said these words. Listen to this. To say living is Christ is to say that for Paul, life means Christ. Life is summed up in Christ. Life is filled up with, occupied with Christ, in the sense that everything Paul does, loves, trusts, hopes, obeys, preaches, follows, and so on, is inspired by Christ and is done for Christ. Christ and Christ alone gives inspiration, direction, meaning, and purpose to existence. That's what Paul was all about. So I believe that if Paul were to speak to us today, as we are sheltering, doing social distancing, isolated, away from friends and our normal activities, I think Paul would say to remember that God has a plan in all of this, and God can still use these things to point us in the direction of that which is most important, living for Christ and knowing Christ. So I want to encourage you, friends. I want to encourage you. While there's a lot that we can't do right now, there are some things that we can do. We can pray. We can pray. We can continue to grow. Instead of binging on Netflix or video games or sleeping in every day, why don't we take time, because we have time now, to study the scriptures more deeply, get to know Jesus more, pray for the work of Jesus around the world, pray for the advancement of missions even in the midst of this crisis. We can pray, we can grow, and through the blessings of technology, you can text, you can call, you can Zoom, you can FaceTime, you can use technology to share encouragement and hope with others. I know many of you are probably discouraged. Maybe some of you are experiencing some forms of depression. And I want to encourage you in the midst of discouragement and in the midst of feeling isolated and lonely, use this as an opportunity to reach out and encourage someone else. Some of the best ways that we can grow as believers is when we get out of ourselves to help others. That's what Paul is about, helping other people grow in Jesus, because his life purpose was to know Jesus. It's all about Jesus, and Jesus can use this time of social isolation in our lives to advance his kingdom and advance his purposes in your life and in my life. That's what I'm praying for. That's what I'm trying to do with my family. And those that I work with that I'm not able to see right now, the pastors that I serve overseas that I'm just trying to stay in contact with through Facebook and through Zooming and through text, I'm trying to encourage everyone and anyone that Jesus is worth it, Jesus is worth knowing, and Jesus can be exalted in this time. And I pray that for you as well. Thanks and God bless. I hope to see many of you next fall in live, face-to-face in a live chapel service. And so in God's good providence and grace, I hope to get there with you. But God bless you all.